Who were the most influential founding fathers? I want you to think about this for a moment. Who would you consider to be the most impactful men in the founding of our country, in the American Revolutionary War, and the beginning of our nation? Maybe you would say George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, or other founding fathers that I haven't even heard of. But what's really interesting to me is that there's a founding father that we have not even considered, most of us haven't even heard of. And this is what John Adams said about him. In my opinion, there is not in Philadelphia a single citizen more universally esteemed and beloved by this fellow than Dr. Benjamin Rush. There is not a man in Pennsylvania more esteemed by the whole state. I know not a man in America more esteemed by the nation. Who he is talking about here is Benjamin Rush. And he is kind of this forgotten founding father who actually had an immense impact upon the founding of our great nation and what we know of America today. He was the father of modern psychiatry. He served as a Surgeon General during the American Revolutionary War. He had a massive influence on the publishing of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, as well as the hygiene that we had going on during the war. So I had actually in high school done a speech and a lot of research on Benjamin Rush. He is my favorite founding father. I was introduced to him by wall builders, and I was then inspired through all of my research to read Stephen Fried's book, Rush, Revolution and Madness. And that book is basically what I'm going to be drawing on from today. There's a lot of other research, but Stephen Fried's writing and researching is just so incredibly all-encompassing that there's really not a whole lot of information about Benjamin Rush that's published that doesn't exist in Stephen Fried's book. So the majority of this podcast is basically going to be a lot of Benjamin Rush's highlights, and if you are interested in this, definitely read Stephen Fried's book because there is so much more than what I could even talk about just today. So what we will be talking about is his early life, graduation, his contribution to the war, his life after the war, and what he contributed to early America, and as well as an interesting story about him predicting John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's both reunition as friends, as well as their deaths. So Benjamin Rush, this kind of mysterious founding father that we've never heard about, he was born in 1749 in Pennsylvania. And his dad had died very early on, so he was sent off to boarding school, and he was very successful at boarding school. And so after doing a very outstanding job, he went to the College of New Jersey, which is now known as Princeton University. He applied at the age of 13 and a half years old. Okay. 13 and a half years old. That is how incredibly outstanding he was. So this is kind of a warning to you. If you're having a bad day, if you're not feeling great about yourself, maybe don't proceed any further, because from this point on out, Benjamin Rush is just going to completely blow your mind with how incredibly accomplished he was. So at 13 and a half years old, he applies for Princeton University. And part of the application process was that they had to take this New Testament passage and change it from Greek into Latin. That is part of the application process. And at 13 and a half years old, he was admitted, but not just as a freshman, but as a junior. As a junior. If that is not an example of how much failure our education system has gone under, then I truly do not know what is. So he goes to Princeton, he exceeds and succeeds, and then upon graduation, he decides to study medicine. So he goes to the University of Edinburgh at Scotland to get his MD. There he becomes fluent in multiple languages and comes back to America to start up his practice. And in America, he immediately gets very involved in not only medical practice, but politics, but in all these different circles, because they're all so incredibly intertwined. And one of my favorite things about Stephen Fried's books is that you can truly tell from his writing how invested he is in historical accounts. So even when he's, writing about Benjamin Rush, there's this other interesting fact that you didn't know, and you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't know he was friends with this guy, and it just creates so much background and understanding and knowledge into what was happening in the Revolutionary War, kind of from the mind's eye of Benjamin Rush. And Stephen Fried utilizes a lot of primary source documents, so it's an incredible read. But one of the things that he talks about is John Dickinson, who is the author of The Farmer's Letters, a very famous set of letters that kind of started this movement of pamphlets being used during the Revolutionary War and the pre-Revolutionary War. But John Dickinson actually had a friend who had gone mad, who had gone insane. And Benjamin Rush, who is now succeeding in his medical practice, joins this team to treat the mad friend. And this is a really interesting case that is what gets Benjamin Rush interested in the sphere of mental health. It's what gets him interested into treating mental health as a disease and as something that's worthy of looking into. And so one of the things that's really interesting here is that at this time in history, mental patients were treated as though they were subhuman, right? So at the hospitals in Massachusetts or Pennsylvania on the East Coast, patients were not given heating in the wintertime. It was thought that they were immune to heating and cooling. So there was no heating that was given to them in the middle of the harsh East Coast New England winters, as well as they were often chained to the ground, things like that. Very inhumane treatments. So Benjamin Rush saw a lot of this that was going on, and he was very, very much awakened to that this was a problem. And the friend of John Dickinson's that he treated had a quote that I think really just encapsulates kind of the thinking of this time from the perspective of someone who was being belittled and being just completely inhumanely treated by other people. "Declare a dog is mad, and he will soon be made so, and afterwards killed for being what barbarity made him." That was kind of the idea. They were just completely treating these people completely barbarically, and then being surprised when their conditions worsened, right? And so the success of John Dickinson's farmers' letters kind of made pamphlets incredibly powerful, right? Pamphlets started to kind of become almost what we would think of as podcasts today, right? So all of a sudden, everyone has their opinions, they're putting them out in pamphlets, everyone's reading them, they become very successful. And so this is kind of starts this almost like new cultural, if you have an opinion, if you're a successful, influential person, you're going to put it out on a pamphlet. And Benjamin Rush then writes a couple pamphlets about mental health, and he also wrote a pamphlet about slavery called Addresses to the Inhabitants of the British Colonies Upon Slave Keeping. And so these were some of the topics that he was beginning to explore. He was very young at this point still. And one of the things that he was thinking about is, okay, mental illnesses are often brought on because of, some type of an environmental, some type of a physical factor. So how can we treat it? And what he writes in one of these pamphlets is, if moral faculty can be injured by physical causes, may it not be improved by the same means? And this kind of marks the first doctor to actually really, really try to start thinking about trying to fix this. There had been other doctors as well, but many of them had just said, okay, we're just going to chain up this individual. We're just going to chain up this person and leave them to it. So this is kind of the beginning of Benjamin Rush's philanthropic dealings. But of course, he was also very, very involved in the sphere of politics. And one of the things was he was beginning to write some of these pamphlets. But he was concerned that if he wrote too many political pamphlets, if they were too controversial, he was concerned about his practice. And so he held off a little bit on some of those, or he would maybe write them anonymously. And so one day he's at a bookstore. He's going to this bookstore in New England, and he meets Thomas Paine, the famous Thomas Paine. They became friends, even though they were very different politically, because Paine wanted a very extreme democracy with just one house and very political figures that were very weak and could be easily thrown out by the wishes of the people. But Benjamin Rush wanted the republic democracy. And so they became friends, even though they were very opposite. And later on, Benjamin Rush became completely convinced that the American Revolutionary War would not happen unless the people understood the importance of freedom and the importance of the cultural time that they were at. So he suggested Thomas Paine, who was a teacher at that point and a writer, that he should write a pamphlet concerning these matters. And what he writes in his diary as the reason that he told Thomas Paine that he should be the one to write it instead of Benjamin Rush is truly, I think, one of the funniest things that I've read from a historical figure. He says he had nothing to fear from the popular odium to which such a publication might expose him, for he could live anywhere, but that my profession and connections, which tied me to Philadelphia, were a great majority of our citizens, and some of my friends were hostile to a separation of our country from Great Britain, forbade me to come forward as a pioneer of that important controversy. And so this is very persuasive to Paine. So Thomas Paine begins to write Common Sense. Benjamin Rush begins to edit it. They meet quite regularly, and they go upon this journey to put out Common Sense. And Benjamin Rush keenly understood the power of the pamphlet. And with that, almost 500,000 copies of Common Sense were sold, which was an insane amount in the time of the Revolutionary War when a lot of people couldn't even read. And one of the things that Benjamin Rush really understood very, very closely is that the revolution, the American Revolution, what we would know of as the American Revolution, was simply a symptom of the true American Revolution, right? And so what he had said multiple times was that people would confound the terms of American Revolution and the American War, saying that they were two different things. They were not the same. What John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson about this in 1815 is, what do we mean by the Revolution? The war? That was no part of the Revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The Revolution was in the minds of the people. And this took place from 1760 to 1775 in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was drawn at Lexington. So I think what's really interesting about this is that when we see common sense in the minds of these founding fathers is actually coming at the end almost of the first phase of the American Revolution, right? The American War is kind of coming, depending on which founding father you're talking to, maybe in the middle or at the end of it, because some of them would say the American Revolution was just the beginning, the American War is more of the middle of this broader context. But what they're saying is that the American War was not actually the American Revolution. It was what the hearts and the minds of the people that were being changed. I think that's very similar to what we're seeing today in political contexts, right? Is that we see that the hearts and the minds of people are being changed by podcasts. They're being changed by political commentary. And then we see the effects and the consequences of that later on. But while this is going on, Benjamin Rush also has fallen in love with Julia Stockton, who was actually one of the daughters of one of the other signers of the Declaration of Independence. That's how he met her, because he was friends with her father, Richard Stockton, and that is how they fell in love. So even though when they got married, she was 16 years old and he was 30, it was a very, very different time, a huge age gap there. But one of the sweetest things was that when they got married, he had massive bookshelves built for her in their home because he wanted her to be able to continue in the development of her mind. So he falls in love with her. They get married just a couple days within the publishment of Common Sense, and so on proceeds his involvement in politics. He really can't afford a lot of distractions here with Julia because he has so much going on, especially with the Continental Congress. So John Dickinson, who I referenced earlier, the author of Farmer's Letters, actually was not in favor of an immediate political war or an immediate withdrawal from Britain. He wanted there to be a lot more kind of negotiations to go on. He was not really in favor of voting in favor of the war, just for a lot of different reasons. And so he ended up getting voted out as being a representative of Pennsylvania for the Continental Congress. And Rush is then voted in. And so then their friendship kind of ends up breaking off, and Rush serves as the Pennsylvania representative for the Continental Congress. Then the next step in Rush's political career, and probably what he's most well known for in most historical circles, is his signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, he actually didn't sign it on July 4th. He signed it on August 2nd. And one of my favorite quotes from Benjamin Rush is probably what he had to say about the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This is what he wrote. "Pensive and awful silence, which pervaded the house." And then he goes on, "as they were called up one after another to the table of the President of Congress to subscribe what was believed by many at that time to be our own death warrants." And that was probably such a true statement, one of the most true statements that Benjamin Rush could have made. Because out of the 56 signers, 9 ended up dying. 9 of them had indeed signed their own death warrants. 2 of them suffered severe battle wounds, and 17 of them lost their property. That's according to Wall Builders and Constitution.org. So this was, in fact, for many of them, not just their death warrants, but their assigning away of their lives as they knew it, including Richard Stockton, Julia's father. He was the first one of the signers to be captured by the British, and then he ended up escaping later on. So at this point, the war is in full blaze. There's a lot going on. And Benjamin Rush, who was a very successful doctor at this point, gets recruited to be on the medical committee. And he's actually serving under former mentors of his in this medical committee. And he's very observant. Benjamin Rush was an individual who was very devoted to detail. And so at one point, he meets this soldier who was captured from the British Army. He was serving in General Howe's division, and he observed that General Howe had ordered everyone to cut their hair extremely short. And so he observes this, and he writes to one of his friends, Colonel Anthony, who is in the 4th Pennsylvania Battalion, and he suggests that this colonial should start a new trend. He should start cutting his hair extremely short as he can. And he says that everyone else will follow suit. And his reasoning for this is that he understands, oh, you know what? We have issues with lice. Lice like long hair. When the men go out and it's raining, their hair gets wet, they catch a cold. All of these problems are coming because of the long hair. So after he suggests this, then this is what ends up becoming our new understanding of the American standard GI haircut, the buzz cut. It actually all started with Benjamin Rush, one of my favorite political facts. And this is the kind of attention to detail that really speaks to Benjamin Rush's character and to who he was. He was always trying to become at least 1% better, right? He was always trying to save as many lives as he could in any way that he could. So in 1777, he was then named the Surgeon General. And while doing this, he writes the pamphlet, Directions for Preserving the Health of Soldiers. And this pamphlet was so incredibly influential, it was used all the way until the Civil War, almost 100 years later. And one of the things that he writes in this is concerning how important medicine was during the time of wars going on. And what he says is the principal study of an officer in the time of war should be to save the blood of his men. If it be criminal in an officer to sacrifice the lives of thousands by his responsibility in a battle, why should it be thought less so to sacrifice twice their number in a hospital by his negligence? And this is actually kind of foreshadowing into one of Rush's biggest political turmoils. Because what ends up happening is that one of his superiors, Dr. William Shippen, Rush finds out is laundering money, ignoring the needs of the soldiers, and basically becoming responsible for the deaths of thousands of different officers. So he appeals to Washington, he appeals to all of his superiors saying, hey, this is a really big problem. They don't listen to him. And so he ends up resigning as the Surgeon General because of that. And that concluded the majority of his influence in the war. But during that time when he was acting as the Surgeon General, when he was even just encouraging the men, hey, stop drinking so much alcohol, change your clothes regularly, make your living spaces a lot more tidy, change your socks, eat vegetables, things like that were included in his pamphlet were incredibly influential in ensuring the health and preservation of these soldiers. But then after the war, Rush remains extremely busy. He does not stop working in his philanthropic matters. In fact, he continues on in his endeavors in mental health. And so one of the hospitals that he worked at quite intensely, one of the things that they had going on is they had all of these mental patients in the basement of the hospital. And what they did was a lot of people wanted to come see these mental patients. And so they would charge people. People could go and pay, a small fee to go kind of watch these mental patients who are in basically cells, treating them as though they're animals. It's really basically treating them like a zoo, incredibly disgusting behavior. And so Rush is pushing against this. Finally, he gets them to say, okay, you know what? We're gonna stop this matter. We're gonna hold off on this. And that was just the type of treatment that people were getting. Some of his other philanthropic influence was he wanted to try and establish public schools. So he wrote a plan for the establishment of public schools and the diffusion of knowledge in Pennsylvania, and this advocated hugely for the education not just of African Americans but also of women. And some of his greatest quotes are about why women should be educated, why we should not be delinquent in educating the female gender. And this is what he wrote here. The opinions and conduct of men are often regulated by the women in the most arduous enterprises of life, and their approbation is frequently the principal reward of the hero's dangers and the patriot's toils. Besides, the first impressions upon the minds of children are generally derived from the women. Of how much consequence, therefore, is it in a republic that they should think justly upon the great subjects of liberty and government. This is what he had to say. He was huge in advocating for women's rights in even so much earlier in the 1700s, when it really maybe wasn't as popular. He then does not stop there. He joins Franklin's first abolitionist group. It's the first abolitionist group to be established. He joins it. He's very influential in it. And this was known as the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and for the Relief of the Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. He writes this pamphlet, and it's very controversial at this time. And so even though Benjamin Rush is very well loved by a lot of Americans, there was a lot of people that really didn't like the things that he had to say. There was a lot of people that did not like some of the things that he had to say about abolitionism. He continues to write more and more pamphlets about women's education, abolition, about mental health, all of these different things. And some of his pamphlets on health actually make their way all the way over to Europe. So they have people now traveling from Europe to America to, see what Benjamin Rush is doing in America. That is how incredibly influential he was. But towards the end of his life, he then has a dream about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Because at this point, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson no longer had become friends. They had become divided because of politics, and they were no longer on speaking terms. But Benjamin Rush was a very outgoing person. He really just knew everybody. And that's one of the reasons why Stephen Fried's book is so incredibly interesting to see, because you don't just get a peek into Benjamin Rush, you're also getting a peek into John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, so many other people. But Benjamin Rush was very good friends with them, and he has this dream that they end up getting reunited and that they would die on the same day. So he writes to them, and he tries to encourage them to become friends again, and he ends up reuniting them. And just a couple of years later, he died in 1813. He was survived by Julia, but he ends up passing away. And his funeral was so impactful during that time. Everybody was lined up for his funeral. People from the Abolitionist Society, people from the black churches that he helped start, students that he had helped train from the colleges that he had helped start. Everybody was there. And one of the newspapers wrote about his funeral. The citizens testified their grief for his loss by the manner they assembled at his funeral. Nothing of the kind has occurred since the death of Franklin and Washington. That is how impactful this man was to the early Americans. They were lining up for his funeral in the same manner as Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, and yet we know almost nothing about him. And upon hearing about his death, Thomas Jefferson writes to John Adams. He says, "Another of our friends of 76 is gone, my dear sir, another of the co-signers of the independence of our country. And a better man than Rush could not have left us. More benevolent, more learned, a finer genius, or more honest." And Adams replies to this, "I know of no character, living or dead, who has done more real good in America." Jefferson and Adams remained good friends until they died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the independence of our country. Benjamin Rush is truly an inspiration, not just in his dedication to his love of Christ, which is, if you read Stephen Fried's book, is very well documented. And not just in his dedication to the country, but in his dedication to his friends, in his dedication to the abolition of slavery, to all of these matters which a lot of people really didn't care a lot about, which weren't really that popular, putting his career in many times at stake. I think that as Christians, Benjamin Rush can truly serve as one of the greatest inspirations for us and someone that we could look up to. And so I hope that you enjoyed this episode of Beyond the Headlines. I hope that you learned a lot from it. And if this didn't convince you to read Stephen Fried's book, I truly don't know what will. His writing is absolutely impeccable. And like I said, I did immense research before even reading his book. And pretty much all of it that is included in Stephen Fried's book. So it's really a really, truly good listen. All right, I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Beyond the Headlines. You can come back next week for another episode.